Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that takes you beyond the myths, the movies and the legends of RAF Bomber Command. I'm James Jeffries and I'm joined as ever by my co-host Jane Gulliford-Lowes. Together we highlight the lesser-known narratives and slowly unravel the fascinating and often contentious topic while inevitably falling down into numerous rabbit holes along the way. Each episode will not only talk about the air crews, but also about ground crews, high staff, and everyone that was a part of RAF Bomber Command. We'll also sneak in chatting about other commands. Shout out to Coastal Command here, who I have a soft spot for, as well as those who are affected on the ground on both sides, including civilians. The legacy of RAF and its strategic bombing campaign still echoes today, often powerfully and emotionally. And yes, fair warning, during this recording, you might also hear the occasional barking of a spaniel in the background. So grab a cuppa, settle in by the wireless, and join us as we climb back into the turbulent skies of history, discovering why Bomber Command's story is far more complex, challenging, and fascinating than it first appears. But for this, which is our final episode of the series, we're in fact not heading into the skies at all. Instead, we're doing something a little different. We'll be going down the ladders, through the hatches and below the waves into the murky depths of the U-boat war. A threat Bomber Harris himself described as an extremely serious menace. But before we introduce today's guests, I want to introduce my co-host, who is the latest champion of Super Gehirn, Jane Gulliford-Lowes. Jane, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Your German pronunciation is much better than mine, I have to say. For those who don't speak German, we'll just call it mastermind, shall we? Or not mastermind.
Yeah.
Refer to it on the evening. Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I really had a wonderful weekend We Have Ways Fest this weekend, which was the fifth one, can you believe? The fifth one that I've attended. I've been there since the very beginning, and it was lovely to catch up with so many listeners and just people I know generally from the World War II history community. Saw some fantastic talks. I actually didn't spend too much money this time on books and things. I read myself in.
Wow.
Yeah, which is quite impressive. But mainly I missed so many talks that I wanted to attend because, you know what I'm like, I just start talking to people and then I can't stop. And I met people like Jamie Heffer, and Jamie's a good talker, as you know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Jimmy's lovely. And yeah, it was just so lovely to see everybody. Met Andrew Panton from East Kirby. Loads of people who've had on the show, and it was absolutely brilliant to see everyone. Thoroughly enjoyed it, but I'm exhausted. And of course, it was lovely to win the comedy mastermind thing on Friday night. I tell you what, though, some of those questions were really hard. The so-called general knowledge was absolutely rock hard. Yeah, as our guest this evening will testify. So now it's time to welcome our guest, an historian and author specialising in modern German and Central European history, with a particular focus on Nazi Germany, the Holocaust and Poland during the Second World War. He studied at the University of London School of Slavonic and East European Studies, worked closely with Professor Norman Davies, and went on to publish a string of highly regarded books, including Killing Hitler, Berlin at War, The Devil's Alliance, and the award-winning First to Fight, which is one of my absolute faves, I have to say. His most recent work before today's subject is The Forgers, and that was named Book of the Year by both The Telegraph and The Spectator. He's a regular broadcaster, visiting professor at the College of Europe in Warsaw, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and in 2020 he was awarded the Order of Merit of the Polish Republic for services to Polish history. That's one hell of a CV, isn't it? His latest book, Wolfpack, Inside Hitler's U-Boat War, is the focus of today's episode. So it's a very real pleasure to say, Roger Moorhouse, welcome to the pod. How are you, and have you recovered from the fest?
Very well, thank you, Jane. Thank you for having me, both of you. It's it was brilliant. We Have Ways is just the most wonderful thing, isn't it? It's a sweet shop for us, World War II fanatics, and absolutely loved it. But exhausting, as you say. So yeah, it's great to be with you. I hope I don't get too much brain fog this evening, and I can actually answer your questions in a coherent manner.
I'm sure you'll manage just fine.
Absolutely. Roger, welcome to the pod. The first question really is quite obvious, really. Why did you decide to write about the U-boat war, and what were your aims with this book?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you're reading out my CV there, Jane, which sounds great when you read it like that. I should get you to read that out every time I appear anywhere because it sounds fantastic. But it's very kind of continental. It's very sort of Central European. That's always where my sort of interest and heart has been. So this is a bit of a departure. That should probably be obvious. But I thought, when I started looking at this and looking for a new subject, as you do, a friend of mine actually gave me a copy of Clay Blair's, he's done this 2-volume History of the U-Boat War, which came out, just before the millennium, I think it was, late 90s. And it's like one of the standard works, really. And a friend of mine gave me one of these when he was clearing out his office. So it sort of sat on the shelf for a long time, and I found myself delving into it. And I thought, it's a really interesting subject. I'm of an age where I can actually remember Das Boot from the first time around. And I remember being sort of kind of dumbstruck by it because it was just so good. It was so intense. It was so claustrophobic. And that's never really left me. It's always been in the background as one of my favourite films. And I suppose the combination of those sort of made me think, okay, well, why don't we try and, what about doing a history of the U-boat war, but doing it very specifically from a German perspective. So you using German sources. And as you grasp from my background, I have very workable German. I used to live in Germany in the 90s. So I thought that's actually quite a good subject. And then the more I looked into it, the more I realised that, in the English language historiography on this, there really isn't anything that kind of does exactly that. There's a lot of material, as you'll know, on the Battle of the Atlantic and other aspects of the U-boat war, but there's nothing really that concentrates on it from a German perspective. So I wanted to flip that, that perspective 180 degrees from the perspective of the surface to the perspective of the U-boats. And there's an added little sort of aspect to this as motivator, which was that once I'd actually started, I was having a family Sunday lunch kind of thing. And my mother-in-law, who is German, in a very sort of matter-of-fact manner, like it didn't really matter and it was just a sort of a little snippet of conversation. She said, she had an uncle who was in a U-boat. And I kind of said, oh my God, why didn't you ever tell me this kind of thing? And she said, he survived. I thought, well, okay, well, he's in a minority there. Only 1 in 4 actually survived the war. And then she said, yes, he used to come to our house late at night, and then we'd have to call the police, and the police would come and take him away. And it transpired that this poor guy had been so damaged by his experience. He was only 22 when he joined up. He'd been so damaged by the experience of the war that he'd spent the rest of his short life in a series of psychiatric institutions, and he used to escape from them and then make his way to the family home because it's the only place he knew. So they were obliged to phone the police, and they would take him away again. And that sort of added to me, it added an angle, or I suppose it added an urgency in to me to, try and, I suppose in a sense, do justice to I suppose people like that. It makes it sound a bit sort of pious and worthy, but it's not intended in that way. Just to sort of, there's a story there. Those people and those like him, they're essentially not part of the narrative, and I thought they probably deserve to be.
Well, certainly one of the things that I thought the book did really well, really enjoyed reading it, is that you're describing the daily lives of the mariners aboard the U-boats, the personal stories, but you talk about the monotony, the routine, the appalling living conditions, and just the abject terror. But I wondered if you could tell listeners a little bit more about the conditions on board. And I remember from your talk at the IWM History Festival, talk about U-boat stink. So if you could talk about that as well, yeah.
Yeah, conditions are pretty horrific. The standard U-boat of World War II is what's called the Type 7, which is fairly primitive technology. It's basically a sort of updated version of the U-boat that they had at the end of the First World War, which is the UB3. So, as I said, it's fairly primitive. It's basically a submersible. So it spends most of its time on the surface and then dives to either attack or to evade counterattack. Very cramped, exceedingly cramped. There's one surviving Type 7, which is in a place called Labour in Germany on the Kieler estuary. And anyone that goes to it, it's up on the beach at Labour. And I would urge people to go and see it. It's amazing. So you walk through this thing, and there's only one place in the whole thing where, where an adult can kind of walk past another adult without sort of doing an embarrassing sideways shuffle. And that's the sort of the main, the centrala, as they called it, underneath, where the periscope is and so on, underneath the conning tower. Everywhere else is, a mass of pipes and wheels and, two huge engines, 300-litre engines, which is just astonishing when you actually think about it. And torpedoes, the men basically sort of slept in bunks and hammocks, strung amongst the torpedoes and things like that. So, it's extremely cramped. And, you walk through this thing and you come out the far end and there's a little information board. And it says, this is a Type 7 U-boat, and it had a crew of 50. And the first time I went through it, and I've been through it a few times, you kind of go, that must be a misprint. Like, how on earth do 50 men even fit in there? Never mind work, fight, or do all the things that a U-boat crew has to do. So extremely cramped. There's very little in the way of sort of creature comforts. I mean, nothing at all, really. They're living on top of each other, effectively. Hygiene is a sort of a distant dream for most U-boatmen. So they get, fresh water is rationed, for example. So they're given a sort of a small aluminium bucket every morning, which they're allowed. That has to, allow for them to wash and brush their teeth and everything like that. And the result is that, most of them basically don't wash. So, because what wasn't rationed was seawater. There's lots of seawater, obviously, so you could wash in that. And they gave you this soap that was rather smelt rather foul. So the end result is that most people actually didn't wash at all. So they didn't shave, so that image of the bearded U-boatman that we have from Das Boot and other things, which looks kind of very romantic and slightly piratical. What would have come with that was a healthy dose of BO and particularly halitosis, because they had scurvy as well. So scurvy was very commonplace. So you mentioned this idea of the U-boat stink. This was a thing, and it comes up in a lot of the memoirs and a lot of the sort of personal accounts of this period. And it's a mixture, as I said, of, pretty ripe BO, because they'd be out for about 8 weeks, an 8-week patrol. And essentially not washing. They were allowed to take one change of underwear with them. So BO would be a particular problem. Halitosis, as I mentioned, from scurvy and gingivitis and gum disease and all of that. Basically, their teeth are falling out. And then add into that mold, because everything's wet all the time. So mold will be rampant. Rotting food, for example, as well. And of course, diesel. And anyone's that spilt diesel while they're filling up their car will know what an absolute mess that makes. And it's a stink that doesn't really go away, and it sort of permeates absolutely everything. So if you add all of that together, you basically get the U-boat stink. And it sort of clings to everything. It clings to their hair. It clings to their clothes. And there was a wonderful story of a U-boat coming into port and them sort of throwing open the conning tower. And the shore staff who were there ready to sort of help them sort of recoil in horror because of this absolute stench that is coming out of the conning tower of the U-boat. So it was a real thing that a lot of the accounts talk about. And there's other accounts of them watching mold grow on the inside of the U-boat, for example, through their patrol, and particularly when they started going down into the tropics. So all of those problems, obviously, like particularly the mold, gets exacerbated by the heat and the damp. So they'd sort of watch mysterious green mold growing up the inside of the U-boat, for example. And then all of this has a knock-on effect to their physical state. So skin infections are absolutely rife, ear infections, eye infections, scabies is common. And then, of course, they're all hot bunking. So all this stuff spreads like wildfire. So they're really in a bit of a parlous state. And obviously that deteriorates as the war goes on. So this was an aspect that loomed very large in all of the accounts that I read. So consequently, it has to loom pretty large in the book as well.
Roger, in the early part of the book, you deal with the rigours of U-boat training, some of which was absolutely horrific. Can you explain what this actually involved? Now, this intense training seems to have been abandoned at a relatively early stage, which I think perhaps resulted in very inexperienced commanders and crews taking to the waves. I was wondered about the factors that resulted in that change from sort of this very, very intense, lengthy training to, virtually nothing at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, Jane, because the beginning, the sort of first generation, if you like, of particularly of U-boat commanders, people like Gunter Prien is, famously sank the Royal Oak in 1939. They were people that had years and years of experience as sailors, right? I mean, he'd been in the German Merchant Marine, for example, before he joined the Kriegsmarine. So, he was someone who was a professional sailor, basically, and then found himself in the U-boat arm, was very effective, as a sort of leader of men, as a leader of a crew. And he's kind of typical. I mean, he does stand out, not only for his tonnage, scored and so on, and for actions like the Royal Oak. So he does stand out in that respect, but he's also quite typical of that early period of U-boat commanders. They're very well trained. They've got a long background to them, a long naval background. But of course, those guys and the crews that were with them, and many of them also had been, in the U-boat arm, since it was kind of reformed in 1935. So a lot of the early phase of U-boat crews have tremendous tradition, huge training, all of that stuff. And they really know their business, right? But if you sort of fast forward to 1941, and it's in March 41, for example, that Gunter Prien is killed, a lot of that first generation of U-boat crews and U-boat commanders have been killed off. So you've got the second generation, which is, those that had been second in command or watch officers with the first generation. They become the new generation of commanders. And then they've got to recruit new crews and train them. So that's already being curtailed and more and more cursory. And that sort of goes on. That trajectory continues through the war. By the end of the war, you're down to really the sort of third and fourth generation of U-boat commanders, at least. Many of whom, weren't even in the Navy at the beginning of war, right? So they're kind of, very often 23 years old, really, not much experience as sailors, because their entire career in the Navy, everything has been curtailed. They had a policy, so Dönitz had a policy from about 43 onwards of pulling in recruits from elsewhere in the Navy. So you could have a desk job in San Malo, for example, and maybe your background was on cruisers or coastal artillery or whatever it was, nothing to do with U-boats. And then because U-boats was almost, in a sense, was the last man standing of the German Navy, right? Because everything else, the surface fleet had kind of gone by that point. It was always confined to port. He was drafting in men from desk jobs and training them up in sort of 6 weeks and throwing them in as a commander or a deputy commander. So you have this massive drop-off. Already British interrogation reports of captured crewmen are already saying in sort of 1941 that the quality has really dropped off already. And a lot of these boys, and they are boys, a lot of them, are badly trained. Their morale is non-existent. They're constantly seasick. A lot of they will surrender. Some of them would surrender at the first opportunity because it was just all so harrowing. So you can see that, and that trajectory just carries on and deteriorates as the war goes on. And consequently, you can see, this is one of the factors in the great turn in the U-boat war, which I think from an Allied perspective and from the perspective of the English language historiography is usually kind of attributed to the closing of the air gap in the Atlantic. Enigma obviously is instrumental there. Technological advances, obviously in countermeasures and so on. Tactical, the Americans coming on board with Liberty ships replacing the lost and all that. All of that, of course, is a massive, massive contribution to the. But the other element that I think traditionally gets forgotten in the English-speaking narrative is that the crews themselves, the German crews themselves, had deteriorated. Their experience was very low. So from 43 onwards, you can see there's a real rapid drop-off in the quality of German U-boat crews. They've got the numbers of boats by that point, but the crews are very, very poorly trained and consequently not terribly good at countering those enhanced Allied countermeasures. So it's a really important aspect of the narrative, actually, is, as you described there, Jane, is charting that drop-off in quality.
I just want to mention something which has just occurred to me from my own book about gardening, Invisible Campaign. I think towards the end of that book, I tell the story of a young U-boat crew, and their captain is a guy called Norman. And he was actually a Navy pilot, and he was recruited, I think, in summer 43 to go and join the U-boat arm. And he and his crew, they're all killed on their first patrol in the Oslo fjord when they hit or come into contact with an air-laid mine, which absolutely literally blows them out of the water. So yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of that desperation.
That's exactly what I was talking about.
Yeah, that desperation exactly to sort of draw people in from anywhere, really, just to man these U-boats. It seems insane, doesn't it? Yeah.
So to give you a statistical basis for that drop off, as I was saying, well, actually more of the turn, from 43 onwards, the world turns upside down for U-boat crews, basically. And as I said, that inexperience is one part of it. There are other aspects as well that we know very well. But to put it into statistical terms, there's a great stat that I've used a couple of times, which is that for, all of the U-boats that are put to sea in 1943 and after, so for the last 2.5 years of the war, right? And it's something like 400 odd U-boats. It's a huge amount of U-boats that are put out in that period. But of them, only 14% of them actually succeed in sinking anything at all.
Yeah.
Right? So 86% don't sink anything. They're literally being hunted to exhaustion and destroyed. And that ties in with what you said about the crew you just mentioned, right? Yeah. They go out on their first patrol. And from mid-44 onwards, basically, statistically, if you look statistically at the lifespan of a U-boat crew, it's already hovering around one mission. And then from the late 44 onwards, it's below one mission. So they're basically going out on suicide missions by that point.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite shocking.
Yeah.
This was February 45, I think. So, their number was definitely up before they'd even
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The number was long up, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the book is full of absolutely incredible stories, but there was one that stood out to me, and that's the sinking of the Laconia and U-156. And I just wondered if you could share a little of this story, but also the ramifications of the incident.
Yeah, it's really significant. It's one of the most sort of controversial moments in the U-boat war, really. And it sheds a light on another aspect that surprised me with writing this book, while I was writing this book, which is the degree to which it's actually a relatively clean theatre of war, which I found surprising because, with what you described when you read my CV out so beautifully earlier on, I've done Polish history. Poland in the war, as you know, is absolutely brutally treated under German occupation. Of course, you've got the Holocaust and all the rest of it, but Polish death toll is enormous. It really is a racial war going on there, which we don't fully appreciate. I don't think. And I kind of assumed when I sort of switched over to do this book, to do the naval war, that you'd see something similar, because it's what we expect, isn't it, with Nazi Germany? But there's very, very little of it. And actually, for the opening phase of the war, really, certainly the first year or so, until the sort of Allied countermeasures really get up to speed and prevent the Germans from doing this, they tended to sort of surface after sinking a vessel, and they would ask the survivors, what was it and where was it heading, what was it carrying, and so on, what flag was it under, and all this sort of thing. And that was sort of standard practice. And then they'd usually kind of, they'd maybe write the odd lifeboat that had turned over. They might give them some blankets and some fresh water and say land is over there, in that way, right? That was not unusual, and it's kind of what we can describe, and I describe it as the solidarity of the sea. It's old-fashioned, seafarers help seafarers kind of thing, and that tradition, I think, in the naval context in World War II, kind of to some extent, not necessarily overrode, but kind of survived and endured in spite of the overlay of Nazi ideology and a much more sort of brutal method of warfare. So for the first, certainly year or so, that was not unusual. Once the countermeasures get up to speed and you've got the more effective, convoy escorts and so on, then it's much more difficult to do that. So very often they would sort of torpedo and run because, of course, they have to, right? But the Laconia is a good example of this. And the Laconia is sunk in September 1942, so relatively late in the war. But it's interesting that it shows that those humanitarian instincts are still there. It's sunk by U-156. under a chap called Werner Hartenstein, was the commander, off West Africa. And Laconia was a passenger ship, it had been a pre-war passenger ship, and it was carrying predominantly Italian POWs and some fare-paying passengers as well. And it sinks pretty quickly, lifeboats are dropped into the sea and so on. And U-156 surfaces, as is standard practice, because it was not in a convoy, it was sailing alone sort of things. Hartenstein could do that. He surfaces to ascertain what the ship was, and he hears Italian voices, basically Italians shouting for help in the dark. And at that point, for him, and he's an old school sailor as well. He's not one of the sort of new breed. He's a bit older. Then a routine sinking kind of turns into a rescue operation, and he spends the next 4 days basically trying to round up the thousands, and there were thousands of survivors of the Laconia, in various, carny rafts and lifeboats and sort of swimming in the water and all the rest of it. So he's sort of, sheepdog actually does the sort of, the wolf turns sheepdog, if you like, and sort of rounds up the survivors. And he actually messages out by radio on Claire, so saying to any other ships in the area, come and help, sunk this vessel at this point, come and help, survivors in the water and so on. Asking for help. He asks for help via Dönitz. They ask for help from the Vichy French authorities in West Africa, for example. They send ships to help, but he's basically doing it for 4 days with another U-boat as well. And then, lo and behold, on 16th of September, they then get overflown by an American air patrol and spotted. And he's got a Red Cross, makeshift Red Cross flag, and he's got loads of survivors up on his deck and all that sort of thing. So it should be pretty obvious what's going on. But he's overflown, and then later that day is attacked, and he just has to dive, and he leaves all these people to their, essentially to their fate, and he's damaged and has to withdraw and all the rest of it. And there are men killed in the water by the attack by the American aircraft. So, which is kind of grimly ironic. But the response to this is an interesting one, because that was not, as I said before, in the context of what had gone before, that was not particularly unusual. There's an added element because of, obviously they're Italians, so they're Germany's allies, but it wasn't that unusual to help the shipwrecked if you had the opportunity, even if it was just, some fresh water and a blanket and the land is that way. So this is obviously a more extreme example, but this marks really the end of that, culture of the solidarity of the sea to a large extent, because the German high command basically goes nuts. So for Dönitz goes and sees Hitler. He's torn off a strip. You say, why were they in that situation in the first place? They should never be helping, enemy crews, enemy shipwrecked personnel and so on. As far as Hitler's concerned, the ship is the target and also the men. Right? That's the message he gives Dönitz. And to his credit, we know Dönitz is a Nazi anyway. He's very much a Nazi sympathizer, thinks Hitler's the best thing since sliced bread. But Dönitz kind of, does fight back with that. Says, no, well, that's not the way it works in naval circles. So he does actually push back a bit with that. And he does, and that policy is never really enacted. But it is nonetheless the end of, offering where possible assistance to shipwrecked crews. So after that, there's the Laconia order is given, which basically bans the assistance given to shipwrecked crews. So it's already a sort of a brutal naval conflict, admittedly with these sort of weirdly sort of chivalrous moments in it. Yeah. But it's still brutal, and we know thousands of people are killed and so on. It is dog eat dog. But that brutal conflict just got a bit harder and a bit nastier with the Laconia order. So it's a really interesting moment in the development of the U-boat war, and particularly in that aspect of that as I said, the respect for those that have been that you've just sunk, and how you treat your enemy.
Now, Roger, we talked briefly earlier about the physical health of the crews and the effects of U-boat life. I felt that the sections on mental health as well that you wrote really added an extra dimension to this experience of what crews had to go through and how demanding U-boat life was. And I just wondered if you could elaborate on these topics and share with us some of the things that you discovered.
Yeah, it's a very interesting angle because it's one that I don't think has really been talked about, certainly not in popular history accounts of this. And I found a couple of really interesting memoranda and studies done, sort of partial studies done in the archive from that time. You have to bear in mind, I think, that, back then, what we now call PTSD was very much in its infancy in terms of how it was recognised and how it was studied and even treated, if at all. Now, that's across the board. But the Germans in particular, and certainly the German officialdom, essentially rejected the concept, didn't want to hear about such human frailties. Their warriors were supposed to be chisel-jawed and ultra-motivated and dedicated and all the rest of it. So they particularly didn't want to hear about this stuff. But there are nonetheless a few Kriegsmarine doctors who start doing this sort of partial studies, admittedly stymied to some extent because the higher-ups don't want to hear about it. The crews themselves very often won't admit to it. But nonetheless, they are sort of compiling some statistics and some details. And that's what I saw in the archive. So it's really interesting. And they say themselves that this is obviously, it's the tip of a very large iceberg. But they're pretty adamant that there is an iceberg there, right? And they're basically saying that from their statistics, probably the majority of U-boat crews suffer with PTSD or combat stress, to some extent. Whether that be, what we could say, getting the shakes perhaps, or there's examples of people sort of rendered mute or having panic attacks, right the way from that to the most egregious example is one commander called Peter Zech, who in the middle of a depth charging attack, pulled out his service pistol and shot himself in the head. So, I mean, that's obviously one extreme, but if you treat it as a spectrum, as they do, this is right. This is, it's absolutely rife, and it doesn't really get talked about. And I think that ties in with what I said at the beginning about my mother-in-law's uncle. He was so profoundly damaged. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions. It ties in with that as well. And once you kind of work from that assumption that this was widespread, you begin to see it in a lot of the memoir material, where they would talk about, the radio operator who used to get the shakes, for example, people that are rendered mute during, or in the aftermath of bombing attacks and so on. So, and I think the intensity of it as well, because obviously this is widespread right across every arm of service in World War II and beyond. But I think the particular intensity and claustrophobia of being in a U-boat, I think probably exacerbates it. So I would, it's all a little bit hazy because we don't have precise figures of necessity. But I think it's probably fair to assume that, it was a particular problem for U-boat crews. And that sort of comes across once you start looking for it.
Well, you mentioned the bombing raids there, and obviously this is a Bomber Command pod, and you write about the effects of the bombing of German cities, including Berlin and Hamburg, and accounts of U-boat crews seeing the effects of this whilst they're on leave. And I wondered if you could tell us a little about what effect this experience has on them, and as well, the bombing war in general against the U-boats. I mean, did the bombing campaign have an impact on the effectiveness of the U-boat campaign?
Yeah, that's a very good question, James. So yeah, in terms of morale, definitely, because you've got crews going home. After a patrol is maybe 8 weeks, as I said, 2 months. They tended to be rotated in threes, so they might have R&R in Brittany or whatever. They might have to do some maintenance on their vessel. Some of them would be sent on home leave, and they would sort of rotate between the three. So those going on home leave, if you went to Berlin or wherever it was, Frankfurt, Hamburg, Essen, whatever, those places that are being hit pretty regularly by 43, 42 onwards, they're seeing all of that. They're increasingly, and I said this in the book, increasingly when they go home on home leave, they're not returning as the sort of, the returning hero. They're returning to bury their parents. That's the kind of the difference. So it's the tone of the home leave changes dramatically as the bombing of Germany itself increases. And that obviously has an effect on their morale. So there's a lot of them, for example, that when they are sort of, the response, I suppose, is twofold. You've got some of them for whom they're sort of desperate to get back to what they consider, I suppose, safety to some extent, sanity, the stuff they know, the stuff they can be vaguely in control of, which means, if you, after a visit home with all the chaos of the bombing and of rationing and of all the rest of it, you just want to get away to something that you know and understand. And then for others, it was a sort of a desperate need to try and do something to, spur them on to do something to protect those people, the home front, your parents, your loved ones, your wife, your girlfriend, whoever it was. So there's a kind of a division in the accounts as to how they react to that, but it's definitely has an effect. And then in terms of a direct effect on the U-boat war itself, I mean, the Allied bombing of the Brittany ports that they used, the U-boat bases, places like Lorient, Saint-Malo and so on, that is certainly by the middle of the war onwards is absolutely catastrophic. Mm-hmm. I mean, somewhere like Lorient, which was one of the biggest bases, it was one of the first bases established and one of the most significant, was all but destroyed in Allied bombing raids. I mean, the city itself is essentially destroyed. The U-boat pens that they've constructed are so well constructed and they're under sort of, 7 meters of reinforced concrete and so on. Ironically, the U-boat base itself is pretty much unscathed, but the hinterland, the city itself, the barrack buildings, the hotels that they use for shore leave and all the rest of it, all of that is kind of gone. And, places like Lorient really, really suffer. So that has a knock-on effect, even if it doesn't directly impact the U-boats themselves.
I'm going to skip the question about gardening because we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to go straight on
that's your favourite subject, Jane.
That's my favourite subject, yeah. We'll have another chat about that another time, Roger, probably about 5 hours. You can't have a discussion about U-boats and the Battle of the Atlantic without mentioning the role of ultra-intelligence. However, I personally think the role of ultra and the eventual Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic is sometimes overplayed. I wonder what your views were on this, Roger, and what other factors you think contributed to the defeat of the U-boats?
Yeah, that's another very good question. There are many. I think we tend, because of the sort of romance and the sort of clandestine nature of the Ultra story, it's been elevated to almost sort of national treasure status in Britain, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And I think we tend to maybe attribute its effects where perhaps it's a little bit undeserved. I think it has a role to play in this, obviously, so that the breaking of Enigma, which is not a sort of one-hit thing, which is, I'm sure you have a wonderfully educated and well-read listenership. They will know it's not a one-hit thing, like you break it once and you're in. There are different variations on the German side. There are different sort of combinations of codes and so on that can essentially lock out the Bletchley Park code breakers for a period of time before they can break it again. So, it's essentially an ongoing battle. So that you get moments where they do have oversight of what the Germans are doing, and increasingly so as the war goes on. So that's the best way, I think, to sort of characterize it. Where they have that oversight, they're able to sort of, divert convoys, for example, from where they know that no Wolfpacks are. They are also able to sort of directly, so not only in a defensive capacity in that way, but also increasingly offensively, to know where individual U-boats are and then be able to target them directly. So you can kind of vector in, a hunter-killer group by the later stage of the war. You can actually vector in to attack individual vessels, which they do with some of the support infrastructure. Like the Type 14s that the Germans use, which are these supply U-boats, which are really important for keeping the attack U-boats out in theatre, was to have them supplied with food, with diesel, and with torpedoes. If you hit the supply infrastructure, you're basically rendering lame all of those attack U-boats that had been relying on it. So the British actually very effectively, using Enigma, started to target the supply network, and very, very effectively. So, it is part of the narrative of the victory from a British perspective. But there are other elements as well. As I said before, the inexperience of the crews from the middle of the war onwards, I think, is really significant. That's one of the aspects that gets forgotten. Also, I mean, probably most significant, I think, if you had to, it's like an A-level history question, isn't it? Which is the most significant thing? I mean, if I had to say one thing, I think it's the development of aerial radar. Because aerial radar in, things like, British, as you said, Coastal Command and other RAF vessel aircraft is able to attack much more effectively to a U-boat on the surface, and they spend most of the time on the surface, of course, than, a destroyer trying to chase it, at pretty much the same speed that the U-boat can go. So you can be on top of a surface U-boat, and they have about 30 seconds from spotting you before you could drop your bombs and you're away. And a U-boat crew can dive at best in about sort of 25 seconds. So it's very touch and go. So once you can spot them from 5 or 6 or 10 miles out using your radar, and you can zero in, and they don't know you're there until 30 seconds before they're about to be hit, that's a game changer. So if I was going to name one, the one contributor of the many, I would say it's aerial radar.
I think the thing with Ultra is that it gives the Allies options that perhaps the Germans don't have. I think there's a good quote by Peter Calvo-Coresi, who I think wrote one of the earlier books about Enigma and Ultra. And basically it gives the choice between strategies and the choice between ways of implementing the strategy that you've chosen, which is exactly what I've just said. It gave the Allied options.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it certainly does have an effect, absolutely, without question. So I'm not going down the road of denying that at all. But as I think there are others that actually are I would suggest potentially more significant, and I certainly would say Allied aerial radar is one of those.
Yeah. Now, with regard to our final question, moving on now, there's a great quote from historian Eric Groves from an article in the Journal of Nautical History, The Mariner's Mirror, which I always reach for when I'm discussing the Battle of the Atlantic. And Groves states that ultimately the battle was won because most convoys lost no ships at all. Do you think the hype and the mythology which surrounds the U-boat war bears any relation to the reality in terms of actual outcomes?
Yeah, it's another very good question, Jane. I think there's an argument here. A lot of the mythology, in the I think maybe specifically British material on this, kind of takes Churchill's famous quote about the only thing that only scared him during World War II was the U-boat war. It takes that, which is a little bit of a throwaway comment in his memoir.
Yeah.
And I think we've collectively run with it for 2 generations, and taken that as gospel, and then in a sense seen everything through that lens. I think the reality of this is that there is a very, very small window of opportunity that the Germans had when convoys and countermeasures are not quite up to speed. The Americans are not yet in the war, so that 40-41 essentially, the Americans are not yet in the war properly. I mean, they're kind of assisting, and they're involved in some escort work, but they're not yet combatant status. And as I said before, the German crews are still those experienced ones that had pre-war experience and so on. So that was the window that something might have been achieved, essentially. But the problem is that they never had the numbers. And by the time they have the numbers, the U-boat arm, Dönitz goes to war with, I think, 27 ocean-going combat U-boats, which is ridiculous, right? I mean, you put them in a chain between West Africa and Iceland, and you can imagine there's literally hundreds, if not thousands of miles between them. I mean, it's insane. So, that's the sort of figures we're talking about. So if he'd had the numbers that he wanted, and he always said he wanted a 300 U-boat force. If he'd had those numbers in the beginning of the war, with all the experienced crews and everything else in place, then yes, absolutely. I think there was a possibility that something might have been achieved in terms of, essentially strangling Britain. But he didn't. And he didn't have his 300 U-boat force until late 1942, right? And by that stage, as I've said, the U-boat war is turning already. The countermeasures are already up to speed. The opening, the first generation of U-boat captains are pretty much dead, as are their crews. So they're increasingly inexperienced. All of that stuff that we talked about, all of that kicks in. And the tipping point is 1943. So just having the numbers was not enough by that point. And if you look at the stats for that second half of the war, I said before, 14% of U-boats, that are put to sea from 1943 onwards sink nothing at all. By the same token, if you're in a convoy, I think the other stat I think is that 99%. I think it was. I mentioned this in the book. 99% of merchantmen in a convoy after 1943 arrive at their destination unscathed, which goes back to the quote you mentioned just now, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there has definitely been the emergence of a mythology, and in a sense, it's a little bit like a sort of, dare I say, a sort of a dam busters mythology.
No, I agree.
Weren't we clever? Weren't we brilliant? It was a close run thing, and we got through it by our pluck and our ingenuity and all that. Yeah, okay. I mean, I agree with that, and that, of course, it's an essential part of the British self-image. But I think in this case, I think it's a little bit like the dam busters. It's kind of a little bit overblown, right? There was a risk in the early period of the war, but it's relatively short-lived, and by the time they had the numbers, they no longer had the advantage. So it's I think we have to put that back into some sort of perspective.
Yeah. Well, Roger, that's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed that conversation. I could talk about the Battle of the Atlantic and U-boats and mining, etc., until the cows come home. I really could. Now, wonderful. Remind us the full title of the book and the publication date.
Yes, the UK edition. I imagine most of our listeners are UK based. UK edition is Wolfpack, Inside Hitler's U-Boat War, and it's published on the 9th of October. The US edition has the same title and is published on the 21st of October. So, yes, do all rush out and buy yourselves a copy.
I'll make sure that we put the links to the appropriate websites, etc., in our show notes so that people can do just that. That's fantastic, Roger.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I've really enjoyed that conversation.
My
James,
great pleasure.
do you want
Thank
to?
you, guys.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you again from myself, Roger, and to our listeners. Thank you for listening. Your support, as ever, truly means the world to us. And as this is the final episode of the current series, we just want to say how grateful we are for everyone who's joined us on this journey so far. Don't forget, though, Never Mind the Dam Busters will return in the new year with Series 4. As always, if you'd like to get in touch with questions or thoughts, you'll find us all the usual ways to reach us. It's all in the show notes, whether that's via social media, email, all the links are provided. If you've been enjoying this podcast, one of the best ways that you can help us is by leaving a quick rating or review on your preferred platform. It only takes a moment, but it really, really does make, really does help us find new listeners.
And if you'd like to go a step further, you can support the pod for as little as £2.40 or $3 a month. Just follow the link in the show notes or head to nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. Now, we should also mention that after many, many requests, we've finally put together some merchandise for our lovely listeners, and you can get some T-shirts and sweatshirts with the pod logo if that's your thing. So look out for those, the links on our social media and in the show notes, and we'll also be emailing all our subscribers with the details. Finally, we'd love to keep the conversation going while we're off air, so come and join our Facebook group or follow us on social media to stay connected. Thank you so much to our listeners, literally all over the world. I think we've got listeners in 120 countries now, which is just mind-blowing. And we will see you all in the new year. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.